mean, it's no secret to anyone who is on Twitter or follows the news that, broadly speaking, Americans are suffering a mental health crisis. It's almost hard to keep up. I think I saw a piece of data the other day saying that suicide is now the second leading cause of death among young people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You are listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny Burtka. Today we are joined by Sarah Gustafson, who is a PhD candidate in government at Harvard University, where she has served as a teaching fellow for Rick Tuck, Michael Sandel, and most recently with Professor Harvey Mansfield. She received her BA at Davidson College and her MA from University College London and Queen Mary University of London. She has been published in Law and Liberty and the University Bookman, among other publications. She has also been a multi-year ISI Richard Weaver Fellow. This past spring, she taught a course in the government department which focused on anxiety and restlessness in democratic times, which she joins us to talk more about today. Welcome to the podcast, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me on, Johnny. It's a real honor. I'm thrilled to be here.
Of course. We're thrilled to have you. And before we get started with our interview, I'd like to thank you all as listeners for tuning into Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourselves. So before we begin talking about this class that you're teaching, I'm just wondering if you can share with our listeners and our students a little bit about your background. I know you studied history originally and then shifted to political theory at Harvard. So what has that journey been like for you?
Absolutely, happy to. So I've always been a humanities person. I went to Davidson College, which is not as well known as it should be. When I was there, it had a 2-year Great Books program, which was absolutely wonderful, and a very strong honor code. So it was actually a wonderful experiment in living political theory, actually, this 100-and-some-year-old honor code at Davidson. There I studied history and French, and meant to be a classics major, but studied history and French, and wrote a senior thesis on the French Third Republic and public education under the French Third Republic. And by virtue of tackling this project, I came to have a lot of questions that were more of a history, political thought, intellectual history nature about the legacy of the French Enlightenment, the history of laïcité, French secularism, and the relationship between religion and contemporary democracy, basically. What was the role of, or what could be what would be the legacy of Christianity and Catholicism specifically in the French Third Republic, and how in light of that should we go about thinking about 20th century democracy? And so I had this wonderful opportunity to go to Queen Mary University of London to do a history of political thought master's degree, thinking that if I didn't enjoy it, it would be a year reading the great books, and if I did enjoy it, wonderful. And it's there that I discovered Tocqueville, actually, for the first time. So I came to Tocqueville not in college, not through any kind of ISI programming, though I wish I had had the benefit of some of that myself. And there I wrote a master's on what he has to say about democratic versus aristocratic historians. And the end of that chapter, he says that doing academic work, doing history, I think it can be expanded to academic work, rightly is a question of elevating men's souls and not completing their prostration. And that has always stuck with me. And so I've continued to study Tocqueville. I took a few years off to work in public policy in the think tank world before coming here to Harvard to study with Harvey Mansfield, Richard Tuck, Michael Sandel, Ryan Hanley, and some really wonderful other people here at Harvard.
That's great, and I want to ask about those experiences at Harvard, but that line that you had mentioned, elevating men's souls without, what's the second half of it?
Not completing their prostration.
Not completing their prostration. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's just a fantastic line. I mean, it points to Tocqueville's unique ability as a stylist, as well as his attention to the ways in which the democratic intellect transforms what we conceive to be possible politically, right? So Democracy in America, Volume 2, opens with his consideration of, okay, what does the democratic social state due to the intellect, our sentiments, and our mores. And so in this particular chapter, he explains that democratic historians, so those who write history in democratic ages, tend to prioritize great forces at the expense of human liberty, whereas aristocratic historians tended to prioritize great individuals, a Napoleon, a Winston Churchill, for instance, at the expense of these broader, say, economic forces, right? Weather, these sorts of accidents of history that can genuinely shape history. But the consequence of getting the balance between great forces and individual liberty wrongly is that ordinary people come to perceive of themselves as not having their own agency and not also having political freedom, right? And so elevating men's souls, that is, treating them as humans with dignity, with a capacity to act freely in history, and not completing their prostration, gets to that sense of we want to make sure that within democracies we do not degrade the human person, that the human person remains free in spite of whatever great forces they might face. And of course, I love the fact that he uses the word soul. Right? Tocqueville speaks constantly of democratic versus aristocratic souls, and that's often a language that many today are uncomfortable with, but I think it tells us something profound about his political theory that he wants to use the word soul there.
That's really interesting, and that opens up a lot of other questions that I'm restraining myself from asking right now, because we're going to get into all of that. Maybe talk a little bit about your experience with Harvey Mansfield. I know he's retiring this spring. It's an incredible honor, that you've been able to work with him. What's it like being mentored by one of the greatest political philosophers alive?
Oh, it's amazing. Professor Mansfield, he was not, I want to make this clear, he was not the person who admitted me to Harvard. but he is an incredibly generous gentleman, wonderful scholar, mischievous scholar, quite cheeky in his way, and that's part of what makes him so delightful. I reached out to him when I was thinking of applying to grad schools and asked for his advice. It was the equivalent of a cold call, but over email. And he responded to me within a few days, giving me really wonderful words of advice and wisdom. And so that kind of care and generosity is something that everyone here at Harvard experiences from him. Whether you're on the political right or the political left, he is well known for being extremely generous with his students and people here in our department. And so, obviously he's quite controversial in his way, but those who take the time to get to know him, I think really come to appreciate his way of approaching politics, which is this blend of seriousness with curiosity, and also a great deal, again, of generosity. I'm speaking of generosity a lot because I think many of us know him quite well from his writings on Machiavelli, from his writings on manliness. But this element of generosity that he has is not something that's often spoken of, or is rarely spoken of. And so that's something that I've been a great beneficiary of.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think when he retires, are there other professors at Harvard? Obviously, you could never replace a Harvey Mansfield, but do you see other professors who would fill the shoes or fill the lane of a Harvey Mansfield kind of in the ranks?
It's hard to say. I'm not really sure. I think hiring decisions are way above my pay grade.
Sure.
So it's hard to say. Unfortunately, hopefully there will be people to step up and play the kind of unique role that he has played for so many years.
Great. Well, you're teaching a course, or you just taught a course on anxiety and restlessness in democratic times. And I think you told me about this at ISI's homecoming, and I said we should have you on the podcast to talk about it because it seemed interesting to me. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you put this course together and what are the sources of inspiration and texts that you're having your students read through.
Absolutely. It's no secret to anyone who is on Twitter or follows the news that broadly speaking, Americans are suffering a mental health crisis. It's almost hard to keep up. I think I saw a a piece of data the other day saying that suicide is now the second leading cause of death among young people. I think 18 to 34 or 44 was the age range. And obviously, we've seen this in older populations too. Ann Case and Angus Deaton's work from a number of years ago on deaths of despair. So there's a sense in which COVID has only accelerated dynamics that have been in play for a really long time. I think you could even point to the famous bowling alone from probably it's 30 years ago now, right? To indicate that something was not right in American souls and American civil society, these sorts of things. And I think colleges and universities have rightly stepped up to try to do what they can to address this developing crisis in our young people. And yet, very rarely do I see it addressed philosophically. And the inspiration for this particular course was threefold. I study Tocqueville. Tocqueville is quite interested in this phenomenon of restlessness in American democracy, and this is downstream of Pascal, but he notices it in a particular way in America. I was on a train I guess in summer of 2021. Yes, reading The Great Gatsby, having just finished for another purpose entirely Augustine's Confessions. And it occurred to me that the characters in The Great Gatsby have a lot in common with the people with whom Augustine is interacting in Milan and Carthage in Rome, and that they are driven by their passions, that they are restless, they are anxious, they are pursuing certain forms of glory and libido dominandi, certain forms of domination, in all the wrong places. And that this has real positive, not positive, that has real externalities, right? And that the novel, The Great Gatsby, shows us how this plays out in the life of this one very particular, community on Long Island. And so that was really the genesis of this course. How can we think about this problem of anxiety and restlessness and its relationship to our broader political culture, our broader political moment, philosophically? So naturally, as a result, we begin with Plato and the city-soul analogy, because that is really, Plato is the beginning of all political philosophy in a sense, and so the city-soul analogy was really, a lot of the class is dealing with the substance of the city-soul analogy. What does it mean for our souls to reflect our politics, and for our politics to reflect our souls?
Well, let's okay, Plato, de Tocqueville. Let's go back to de Tocqueville, and then we can the phrase you're using, democratic souls, is jumping out at me. But let's go to Tocqueville, who also who uses that phrase. One thing I'm thinking about Alexis de Tocqueville, one thing that I recalled from the last time that I read Democracy in America was this anecdote about how Americans, they will buy a field and, sow their seeds in the springtime. And then before they harvest their crop in the fall, they've already sold the property and, moved west for another opportunity. Mm-hmm. So there's, I think in that anecdote, you can see that this restlessness has been part of the American character for some time. That there might actually be some benefits to it in terms of entrepreneurial energy and dynamism, but at the same time, it comes with obvious costs to community and to culture. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where exactly that anxiety comes from, and then also how it has morphed over time since Tocqueville wrote his book.
Absolutely. So I think what's important to note, right, is that anxiety and restlessness, looking, again, this is part of why the course wanted to look at this broad span. We spent 5 weeks on Tocqueville, but we had this, broader look that anxiety and restlessness is in some sense endemic to the human condition. Our hearts are restless until we rest in you, right? We have this sense, even if you don't have a kind of Judeo-Christian concept of original sin, there is this deep sense in most political philosophy, right, that humans are in some way in need of fixing, that there is something something off, something wrong that needs to be elevated, right? And so anxiety and restlessness, endemic, what do we do about it? How do we go about seeking peace, right? At the same time, we can also say that that the sources of anxiety or restlessness may not be merely or purely in ourselves, right? That there are structures, political institutions, social, cultural institutions, systems of technology. Tocqueville used the term social state, right? Mores, customs that we build together that can exacerbate our restlessness, exacerbate our anxiety, right? And so I think that the passage that you're referring to about the planting of the field and then moving on, I believe it comes from Volume 2, Part 3. There's another wonderful chapter in that when he talks about the duration of leases in democratic times, and how leases get shorter and shorter and shorter because we constantly want to move and are constantly looking for the better apartment, the next house, all these sorts of things, the better car, right? We only want to lease the car for 2 years instead of 3, something like this. And so I think what Tocqueville notices is that this natural restlessness, this restlessness that is in a certain sense proper to human persons because it flows from our freedom, right, is exacerbated by democratic mores, democratic norms. And you're right to say that this is not entirely a bad thing, right? That it conduces to innovation, that it conduces to a certain, he makes this really nice contrast between Americans and French Canadians. He says French Canadians, they moved to Canada, they settled down, they were very content to stay there. Americans are not like that. Americans have this thumotic spirit that is a passion. A thumos is a passion, right? A desire to go and conquer, a desire to go and innovate, to make good, right? A faith in human perfectibility, he says. And yet, it is in some way destructive of community, right? It is in some way, in order for it to be ordered, it needs to be balanced by what Tocqueville says are aristocratic remainders, essentially, right? This would be religion, appreciation for the township, certain mores that he believes that women hand on particularly, right? And so absent that, Tocqueville actually becomes deeply concerned that this American passion, which a lot of it boils down to what he calls materialism, right? Which is the same sense in which we speak of materialism today, that it becomes exacerbated to such an effect that it does start to have much more profound and lasting negative externalities.
So, okay, the thumos, the conquering spirit, is that, it's interesting that, he observes that the French Canadians don't quite have that or possess that the way that the Americans do, and, Americans are, like you said, perpetually driving west, and once the frontier closed in, we looked for other frontiers,
Right.
So, now, is that the spirit of conquest, though, in some sense strikes me as something that would be part of an aristocracy, sort of an aristocratic desire for greatness. I think there's another section in Tocqueville where he's talking about the aims of democratic man are sort of lower than these sort of big, sweeping, noble projects that, the aristocratic mind might conceive of. So is that conquering spirit, how does the conquering spirit work or not with the democratic mindset?
Right, absolutely. So you're right to say that, yes, for Tocqueville in democratic times, our ambitions become more petty and they become fewer, right? This is, there's a lot of talk of meritocracy these days. Is meritocracy good? Is meritocracy bad? Well, meritocracy is a byproduct of democracy, right? Meritocracy emerges as a way to justify a certain kind of greatness, right? That if it's good that you rise through the ranks that we have determined to be appropriate and fitting in order for you to be great in a certain capacity, right? But what I find so attractive, or one of the things that I find so attractive about Tocqueville, is that he's keen to note that human nature does not necessarily change It is just deformed or reformed or degraded in certain ways, right? So thumos, this conquering spirit, which could also go by vanity, by pride, vainglory, right? Different political philosophers have different ways of capturing what is sort of a similar phenomenon. Certainly exists under aristocracy and takes various aristocratic forms. It does not go away under democracy. It gets formed and channeled differently. And then the question becomes, is that good or bad? Or the question I'm constantly asking my students is, in what way good? In what way bad? Because rarely is it just one or the other, right? And that's a point he makes about democracy as well, that democracy is in some ways good and in some ways bad, and that it's worth bearing these two things in mind at the same time.
And back to your point about you appreciating the phrase democratic souls, I guess when I hear that phrase, I immediately felt like I wanted to resist it because, you know, I might think of, you know, democratic, I don't know, citizens or, you know, democratic. What it makes me, it's what's unsettling about it is to think of the idea of democracy actually forming your soul. Normally, I guess maybe I just box politics, you know, off from the soul. Maybe I shouldn't do that, but it's striking, you know. Or maybe I think I don't want to be labeled as a democratic soul. So, like, what exactly does that mean? And is this a new? I don't know. At what point did the democratic soul sort of emerge, and how is it different than the soul under the Roman Republic or the soul under, you know, the Roman Empire?
Absolutely. Well, so, you know, in this course, right, I think one of the obstacles that was in my mind that I had to overcome was resistance, possibly, to the use of the word soul in this way, right? And yet we see, dating back, you know, starting with Plato, right, that there is this very intimate relationship between the soul, you know, which in Greek is psyche, which is the root of our word psychology, right, and the regime. And Plato very beautifully in the Republic describes how the best regime, how the ideal regime, the city and speech, generation by generation degrades, and how that is revealed in the souls of its citizens, right? Revealed by the things that they love, right? And I think, you know, this is something that Augustine is obviously concerned with, right? How does the Roman Republic, what do the people of the Roman Republic love, right? Or the people of the earthly versus the heavenly city, right? And how does that shape the ways in which they go about their earthly life, right? And so it's not that this my use of the word democratic soul, I think, has thankfully has this good pedigree, but I think it's also helpful in pushing back against a certain kind of thought about politics, which is to say that our politics is not a teacher in some way, right? I think there are lots of debates sort of within our contemporary circles, right, about is politics downstream of culture, or is it the other way around? And I think the realization that the regime and the soul reflect each other in some way allows us to say, actually, both of these things are true.
Yeah.
Right? That our politics reflects something of who we are, because we are, particularly in a democracy, because we are its citizens, right? And also that that law shapes us in some way, and that these things exist in a dynamic interplay.
Okay. No, I definitely, that makes a lot more sense of it, and I agree with that. So getting back to the anxiety in the soul, which is you know, part of the human condition until the soul rests in God, and even for souls who are resting in God, it can still be a reoccurring, you know, struggle. What are the ways in which, you mentioned some of the ways in which in a democratic society we check those with other sort of things like family or the inculcation of manners or institutions of civil society. How did the ancients, what medicine did they provide for anxiety or restlessness? And might there be lessons we could draw from that?
Absolutely. So the arc of the course takes us into the 20th century. I mentioned the Great Gatsby earlier. That's really sort of the end of the arc of the course in a certain sense. But we concluded with Aristotle, excerpts from the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics. And I happen to love Aristotle, and I desperately wanted to include him in this syllabus because I think he provides the answers, but it did not make sense given the arc of the course to put him at the beginning. And it was actually Yuval Levin's suggestion to put him at the end. So I give that credit where it's due to Yuval. And so, by the end of the course, I wanted to offer students a kind of an answer. And so that answer is the same one I'm giving you, which is philosophy and friendship and contemplation. Virtue-seeking friendships in coordination with pleasure-seeking friendships and the other kinds of Aristotelian friendship, right? Because I think, actually, one of the brilliant things that COVID probably taught many of us is that just because not all of our friendships are virtue-seeking friendships does not make them less valuable, right? That being in an office with people that we see every day, that is still an incredibly important part of our human flourishing, even if they're not our virtue-seeking friends. And then philosophy, contemplation, leisure in the proper sense of the term, right? I didn't assign Josef Pieper Leisure, the Basis of Culture, but I could have, and I thought about it quite seriously. I did assign an essay by Jennifer Frey and an excerpt of Zaina Hitz's fantastic new book, or relatively new book, Lost in Thought. And I would like to think, or my hope is that these two answers, friendship and contemplation, are something that all of us, but particularly college students, can take away and do something with. It was remarkable to me the frankness and candor with which students spoke. I've had this experience teaching Aristotle on friendship several times, particularly in this context. Spoke about the dearth of genuine friendships that they have. I had one student say that she didn't think that virtue-seeking friendships were possible because she had never had one.
Really?
It's just, it's terrible to hear, but I applaud her for her honesty, right? It would be very easy to pretend like you have a million, well, maybe not a million, 5 virtue-seeking friends, right? So that's the friendship part. The contemplation part, again, our restlessness needs to be balanced by rest. The week that we read Pascal, I asked students to spend 10 minutes in their room with their cell phone on the other side of the room and just be. And they all said it was incredibly, incredibly difficult. Many of them didn't make it to the 10 minutes. And I think it would be difficult for most people nowadays. But I'm glad they did the exercise. I'm glad they trusted me on that. And so the ability to contemplate, to spend time with yourself, not to meditate your navel or something, right? But to rest, and then also to participate in genuinely leisure activities that are not necessarily restful, but cooking a meal, enjoying time with friends, playing the piano, these sorts of things. I think those are the beginnings of an answer that come from the ancients more than from the moderns.
And that particular student, without revealing too much about their personal details, do you think their situation is there example? Is that sort of widespread, do you feel, throughout our culture, regardless of the institutions or sort of class structures? Or do you think that's more of a function of being kind of an elite, a meritocratic environment and just, I don't know, maybe the cutthroat nature of always feeling like you have to perform to achieve a certain standard? How much of this is wider cultural versus the culture at Harvard?
Absolutely. obviously there are special dynamics at play at an institution like Harvard or at its peer institutions.
Sure.
Right, but I don't believe, and I think that the statistics, the data bear this out, that this is a uniquely Harvard problem. I do think Americans are increasingly lonely, and without parents, without this is just a problem that will be compounded over generations. Sure. If young people don't see their parents having deep friendships, how are they going to learn how to have deep friendships? Mm-hmm. Right, and so it. I think there's actually something very valuable, or I hope that there's something valuable in students reading something like Aristotle's account of friendship and yearning for that, mm-hmm. having a hunger for that, because that opens a space of possibility where they can go out and create it.
Absolutely.
Right. And so, there's a lot that can be said about higher ed specifically, and I think a lot of the problems that we see in higher ed today. But it's in the context of the classroom that I actually get a lot of hope. In the context of these conversations with students where they're really grappling with these deeper questions of the great books of the Western tradition, and bringing them to bear on their own lives on these very deep and personal and challenging issues that are striking our young people. I actually see a lot of hope in that.
And what concrete examples might you be able to offer our students, or things they can try, beyond the 10-minute exercise of sitting and contemplating? What are sort of like the easy things they might be able to start to implement in their own communities?
Well, I think it is a good habit to make a habit of going out of yourself.
Okay.
So whether that is in the form of friendships and friend groups, volunteering, exercising, cooking, there is a lot of freedom found in doing things with your hands. And I say that as a graduate student who is constantly working with her mind. So
Sure.
So doing things that are in the world, bodily, physical, material, social, and communal. That could take the form of worship as well, obviously. Making a habit of leisure, right? And this may be particularly difficult for some students, I think, depending on their background, right? If they don't have it modeled, how do they go about doing it?
Sure.
And it begins with not scrolling. You can probably tell I love teaching, and I love my students, and eventually I get to a point in the semester when I can make fun of them and they don't get mad at me. And so TikTok, why?
Yeah.
Right? There are many other meaningful ways, and they know this to be true. They know this to be true, right? Deep down, they have these deeply set intuitions, right? That it is objectively better to spend a night with friends cooking or baking cookies, or something simple like that, right, than doom scrolling.
Yeah.
And so it's a simple matter of activation energy, I think, of invigorating that yearning, that desire for something more than what is being offered to them by the scripts of the world right now. Be that a Harvard, or another institution of a similar kind, the meritocratic rat race, whatever it happens to be.
Okay. Now, zooming out a little bit to public policy. So I know that you're putting forward friendship and contemplation as cures for some of the ills of democratic life. In a sense, those things have consequence. They are political, or they have a consequence for politics. I think about when Aristotle's talking about friendship and how friendship, seems to hold cities together, and when people are friends, there's no need for justice because they treat each other well, and so you don't need the heavy hand of the law to adjudicate disputes as much. So I certainly would see both of those things as contributing to sort of a more flourishing city or national public life. But at the same time, I'm curious if any of your, if this study has produced any thoughts in yourself about how public policy, or if public policy, might be able to help mitigate some of the anxiety and restlessness, or if you think generally it just gets in the way.
I do think it can. As I said, law is a teacher, right? And so I think one of the great, again, as a student of Tocqueville, I tend to think one of the great misunderstandings about Tocqueville is that he is a hands-off libertarian.
Sure.
That is not the case. He is certainly a liberal, but he's a liberal of a very strange kind, and he is the first to recognize that that you know our politics shapes who we are in some way, right? He's a great liberal critic of liberalism.
Yeah.
Is what how I like to refer to him. And so, yes, I do think there should be some kinds of political responses, but I'm not a policy wonk by profession, despite having worked in it a bit, and so I don't want to make too many. I don't want to make a policy proposal right here, right now.
Sure.
Except to say that it is important and worthwhile, and I think downstream of friendship and contemplation, to be willing to address, debate, and elaborate attractive, normative visions of human flourishing. And that our politics ought to work to produce that. Our politics reflects us, which also means that, you know, to the degree that our political systems, our political structures are not supporting that normative vision of human flourishing, that does not mean we are without agency either,
Sure.
right? And that is where civil society is absolutely crucial in changing the Overton window, in making possible and making visible a certain normative vision of human flourishing. But I'm dodging your question because I'm not a policy walk. And I certainly hope to think about that more, because that's a question that has been on my mind a lot
absolutely.
since teaching this course. But in my current mode, principally as a student of political theory and as a teacher of political theory, I would like to think that a certain form of I would like to think that a certain form of education eventually, and this is to quote Plato, might make the pattern of the Sidian speech that is in the sky for our souls possible in us.
Well, I think that's almost a good way to end. I have one more ISI question for you, which is, you know, ultimately what we're trying to do is to educate students for liberty and for public virtue, and we're creating alternatives to much of what is being offered in higher education today. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for us based on this course and based on what you've learned from your students for how we can be doing what Russell Kirk described as capturing the imagination of the next generation. So any thoughts or insights for our work at ISI?
In my experience, caring about, I mean, I think ISI already does this, but
Sure.
The power to teach and to educate for liberty really depends. Depends on how compelling the material is, and it depends on the moral authority of the teacher.
Okay.
So a lot of what I feel that I have to do as someone who cares about teaching very deeply is to establish a relationship with my students in the classroom such that we can have substantive debates about hard issues. We can discuss Tocqueville on race. We can discuss Tocqueville on women. And students can feel free to raise objections, to ask difficult questions. And a lot of that is it's more it's more the manner of approaching the material in the person of the teacher setting what the classroom can and should be. There's a wonderful I'm a pop culture. I love pop culture, and I actually find it helps me to connect with my students. There's a wonderful movie that came out around the same time as the Dead Poets Society.
Okay.
Less famous than the Dead Poets Society, which I do not like at all. And this film is called The Emperor's Club.
Okay.
And it is about a middle high school teacher, who's a Western civilization teacher, and his experience working with a group of young men as they go through school, and his own challenges as a teacher to be both just and merciful, to see the potential in his students and to draw it out, but also to be just, right? And to educate them in a certain kind of moral virtue as he's going about it. And so I think education in the best sense calls something out of students. It does not necessarily convince them to take one position or another, but it awakens them, as you said, to a certain kind of moral imagination, and particularly for political philosophy, to think to think in a creative, impassioned, but also philosophical manner about the horizons of possibility. And so that's, I think, a lot of what I try to do in the classroom is to awaken this, to encourage this, and to also show them that contemplating is fun.
Yeah.
And it does not need to be attached. Often is attached to activism, but it need not be attached to activism for it to transform their lives in some meaningful way.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thanks so much for joining us, Sarah. If people want to stay up to date on your work, where can they look or follow you? I take it not on TikTok, but
no. Oh goodness, no. I occasionally appear in Law and Liberty, as you said. Occasionally on various social platforms as a result. And I am here at Harvard. So my online presence is pretty minimal at this point. But what can I say? I'm writing a dissertation.
Sounds like a smart approach. Well, thanks again for joining us, and thank you all for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.